Hi, I'm Mark Reed. Follow me as I attempt to put my new book, Impact Culture, into practice and discuss it with others taking a similar journey. You'll get tips that will help you achieve more impact from your research and stay healthy, no matter how busy you are. Rediscover your purpose. Lead from behind to empower those around you. Transform your work culture. Welcome to Season 4 of the Fast Track Impact Podcast. Welcome back to the podcast, and this week I am so excited to have Professor Eric Jensen on the call with me today. Eric's a long-standing collaborator of mine. I have learned so much from him over the years, and that's why I'm so excited. If we can even share a fraction of the things that I've learned from Eric in this interview, then you are in for a treat. So Eric has many hats that he wears, and I'm never quite sure how to introduce him, but I'm going to give you them all today. Eric is the Chief Executive Officer, CEO of the Institute of Methods Innovation, where he does impact training. In particular, he trains on monitoring and evaluating your impact. So a very useful person to know, and he'll maybe signpost some of those resources and courses. He's also a CEO of Qualia Analytics, which is a survey platform that can help us to evaluate our impact again. A particularly powerful platform. My colleagues and I have started using this and have been just slightly blown away by what it can actually do and how easy it is to use. He is also a senior researcher at SRU, my research group, working with Hannah Rodman and a whole load of other people in the Thriving Natural Capital Challenge Centre out of Edinburgh. And he's also on a career break at the moment from a very part-time role at the University of Warwick as an associate professor. So, Eric, thank you for joining us today. How are you?
I'm great. Pleasure to join you.
Brilliant. So one of the many things that it's one of the many ways I've been able to learn from you is from your textbook, Doing Real Research, which is a methods textbook for social sciences. But the way that you've written this is incredibly just accessible, whether you're an undergraduate or like many of us. I'm not a social scientist, but I would like to dabble in some of these methods. For example, I want to create a survey to evaluate the impact of my research. It's a very common method that people use, and yet without at least a little bit of knowledge about how to design a good survey, things can go remarkably badly wrong. It's one of these things that you can figure, yeah, that's easy. I'll just get myself a free SurveyMonkey account and write a few questions. What could go wrong? So, Eric, what could go wrong?
Yeah, I mean, just like any social research method, it does take a degree of expertise and training to be able to use these tools effectively. As somebody who did a PhD in sociology, I had years of training in survey methods, in quantitative and qualitative analysis, this kind of thing, as well as a lot of reading since then. So I think the most important kind of first point that I like to emphasize is that we do have a lot of good knowledge about what constitutes best practice when it comes to designing surveys or other kinds of data collection instruments where we're gathering information from people. We know what works effectively and what doesn't. There are specific kind of mistakes that can be made that can mean that the results you get are basically meaningless, or sometimes even worse, where they're kind of misleading. So a common example a simple example is a lot of engagement activities. They'll include a question like, did you learn something new today, as an outcome measure to try to articulate impact. And that kind of simple question, yes, no, did you learn something new today, might sound initially appealing, but actually, if you think about it, somebody saying yes to that question doesn't necessarily mean that they learned anything at all. It's just because they said yes doesn't mean that they actually learned something that you would recognize as learning. And you could also be undercounting impact. Like they may have picked up information. They may have kind of done something that they wouldn't want to count as learning because that would make them sound like a student, for example. So this is just a kind of small example that you have to be really careful with the phrasing and also with the kind of realism when you design survey questions to think, is it realistic that somebody's going to be able to do a kind of retrospective assessment of what did they know before they encountered this engagement activity? What do they know now? And then provide you with an assessment of what had changed. So in this case, the better approach is to do, for example, a pre-post test where you directly measure what somebody understands or doesn't about a topic, and you see whether that's changed. So a common question that I use, for example, is variations on what comes to mind when you think of. So if it was about, for example, biodiversity conservation, maybe I'd ask what comes to mind when you think of biodiversity. I'd ask that before and after an engagement activity that was about biodiversity. And then I would be able to see for myself what has changed in the kinds of thinking they have about that topic. And I would do the kind of heavy lifting of analyzing the difference between pre and post, as opposed to expecting my participant to do that kind of very cognitively intense activity of trying to make that kind of self-assessment.
Yeah, instantly you can see the value of that. I guess if you can't do the pre-intervention test, just asking a more open question, what do you think you learned, after the yes might give you a bit more to go on. But as you said, lots of reasons why you still might not get anything useful from that. I guess you could also ask questions around capacity building. Is there something that you can do now as a result? And there may even be a skills test that you could build into that survey to check whether they can actually do the thing that in theory they've learned about. So you've got evidence that you built capacity in some way, or unlikely to happen, but you never know. If you've designed something specific to shift to people's attitudes, there may be some attitudinal questions in there. But in terms of the things that we might count as impact, I think those are probably the only three things that you're going to be able to get from a survey on the day. Other than perhaps some intentions of what I would like to do more instrumentally after this, and perhaps then, crucially, a tick box that gives you permission, GDPR compliant, to follow up with them to then find out whether they actually then did something more instrumental after the event.
Yeah, so a longer-term follow-up survey is often a step that I add to impact evaluations. So there it's important to have the pre and post to isolate the effects of the initial intervention. So for example, if you only were probing about people's skills at the end of a workshop, then you would have no way to prove that those were skills they didn't already have at the outset. So you would then do pre and post to isolate what happened in the workshop, and you follow back up later at a sensible time point. That might only be a month later. It could be 3 months later, 6 months later, 12 months later. But if you have the consents, you can follow up, and then you can look at what happened after that first experience. So for example, when I've done this, a common pattern is that you'll see a pretty big improvement initially in the initial pre-post from the experience, and then it will level off to somewhere better than they started, but not quite as good as they were at the end of the workshop, for example. That's a typical kind of long-term outcome.
Brilliant, and crucial to have the ability to do that, not only in terms of the rigor and to what extent something might be lasting from that initial intervention, but also just to see how things mature and how one thing leads to another. And now there are multiple confounding factors going on here, but perhaps I can still make the argument that that intervention was a starting point, at least, for where this eventually ended up going. So yeah, if this is something that people are thinking about, yeah, I'm doing surveys, I'm planning surveys, I could probably do better. I'll make sure that I've got a link to your book in the show notes. And what are the things that you offer people through the Institute for Methods Innovation?
Yeah, so the book is called Doing Real Research, and that is aimed at people who are not social scientists and helping to kind of provide very practical guidance, the kinds of things that I tell people in person the kinds of realism that you sometimes don't see in textbooks because the kind of idealized versions are placed there. I try to provide all that kind of practical guidance about trade-offs and that kind of thing in the book, doing real research. The kinds of services that we offer through the Institute for Methods Innovation, which is a nonprofit that's based in Europe and the United States. We do a lot of consultancy projects where we help organizations like government agencies, research institutions that want to evaluate the impact of their programs or activities. We help them in a variety of ways. So sometimes we just kind of help them get set up with a good survey design and a kind of system for dealing with their data. So kind of supporting them to use their own staff the most and to kind of get help where it's most needed. So with the kind of most expertise intensive elements of the evaluation. In other cases, we do the whole process from start to finish, from kind of inception to completed reports and journal publications in a number of cases. And we also offer a lot of training. So sometimes, for example, we'll provide training on survey design, on quantitative data analysis, things that can help people kind of do it themselves for evaluation. And then sometimes it's a kind of hybrid where it's what's known as like a developmental evaluation, where people are developing the skills to do this themselves while you kind of go along with them in the process. So there'll be so for example, if they were going to do focus groups, I would give them some coaching and training ahead about how to conduct a focus group effectively. And then I would listen to the audio from the focus group where I could hear them doing it and give feedback about how they conducted that focus group and how they could do that more effectively, support them through the process of developing categories for the data analysis, that kind of thing. So kind of providing that kind of expert support all the way through. Basically, the Institute largely kind of fits into the gap between expectations of people who work around research impact. There's a lot of expectations about gathering data, analyzing data, using data around research impact. And yet the training for people who work in this industry often doesn't provide the kind of key elements they need to do that independently. And so we end up plugging that gap in a variety of ways, depending on kind of how it manifests for particular research organizations.
Yeah, and of course the expectation gap is sometimes the amount of time it takes. Yeah, we expect incredible, rigorous evidence for your impact, and yeah, where am I going to get the time to actually do that? So as with you, my goal with this podcast is, and with this series on evaluation, is to give everyone the skills they need to do this themselves wherever possible. But when you do realize, I don't have the time available, but I can get a budget for this, and increasingly universities are making budgets available for impact evaluation. There are many people like Eric out there, including Eric, of course, who can actually do that heavy lifting for you, or potentially do a mixture of the both, so that you've got that evidence there for you on the plate, but you've also got the skills, ideally, at the end of it. So I'll put a link to IMI in the show notes if people want to follow up on that. But moving into evaluation, you do impact evaluation on a regular basis, and one that I helped with recently that you led used theory of change, and this was fascinating for me because in the paper that we wrote in Research Policy a few years ago, we identified theory of change and logic models as a category of impact evaluation tool. And until I'd done that work, I'd only ever thought of these as impact planning tools. So tell me a bit more about how you can use what is a theory of change, in case people aren't familiar with this, and how you use that as an impact planning tool. But then how you can turn that into an evaluation tool. And maybe let's dig into this particular example just to get a sense of how this works.
Yeah, so typically theory of change and logic models are impact planning tools. That is how they started. So a logic model is where you identify the kind of outputs from a program, the outcomes that are supposed to be delivered from a program, and you kind of map them out in a table to kind of show the logical sequence of events. So you input X and you get out Y, basically, is what you show with a logic model. And theory of change is just a little bit more elaborated. So it's meant to be a more comprehensive kind of mapping of how you go from point A, your starting point, to the outcomes that you're aiming to deliver. And the core value of doing that is to be able to identify potential gaps in your planning. So when I have supported organizations to use it as an impact planning tool, it's been very helpful. And that's because there are often gaps in the plan. So, and sometimes things that just don't logically line up. So I've encountered, for example, efforts to reduce poaching in rural Brazil. That was the kind of intended outcome, so bird poaching. And then what they were actually planning to do was give presentations in schools to school children. And there was just a massive logical gap between who is actually the one primarily responsible for doing the poaching. It's adults, of course. And then who are you going to be delivering this engagement to? It's children who are not the ones primarily responsible for the problem. So the ensuring that the plan at least holds together logically is what you can achieve with those kind of impact planning tools. But there's no expectation that once you take those impact planning tools out into the wild, that that's actually going to be how things are going to play out exactly. So the real world is obviously much more messy than what we imagine when we're writing a grant proposal or an impact plan. And so once reality starts happening, you have to adapt, you have to adjust, you find out, oh, there's a new opportunity here. So your plan ends up zigging and zagging. It's not these simple straight lines that can be written at the outset. And you find that there are a number of kind of secondary factors that affect whether you're able to deliver impact as you planned. And so the idea with taking this a step further and looking at theory of change empirically, which is what we did in a project for the research center in Scotland that focuses on water, the Center for Expertise on Water called CREW. There, they were wanting to do an impact review after 5 years of projects that had been running relating to water in Scotland. And their primary aims there were to deliver policy impact. So to take research relating to water and feed that in to government agencies and government departments to influence policy. And they have quite a sensible structure for doing that, a very logical structure of starting from policy needs, involving the policy stakeholders in the actual definition of the research requirements, and involving them throughout the process. So this was a smart way to set up their center in order to deliver impact. So far, so good. In terms of impact planning, things were great. Then when we look retrospectively, we had the opportunity to gather data about what did this actually look like in practice? Did this play out as intended in that kind of initial planning? So we gathered data from external perspectives, from some of those policy stakeholders to say, what did this look like from your perspective? We gathered data from researchers to say, what did the process look like from your perspective? And then also from inside the research center. And we put together these different perspectives to identify theories of change that were based on empirical evidence rather than just a kind of desk-based exercise to say, here's what our plan is in the prospective. So based on that actual evidence, we were able to develop pretty sophisticated theories of change that have a lot of identification of secondary factors, of things that can promote or reduce or affect or can be barriers to impact. And so that design meant that we were able to provide them with something that was both an impact evaluation. So it does tell them what kinds of impacts they were developing and how that played out. And there was systematic evidence to support those models. But those theories of change then help to inform how they go about doing things in the future. So they can use these as guidance to see, okay, where are we facing the biggest challenges? Where are the kind of issues that if we don't put this kind of step in place, we will miss out on important research impacts, that kind of thing. So the idea was to, typically it would be seen as a liability to only conduct an impact evaluation like that at the end of a 5-year program. It would be much better to start right at the beginning with an impact evaluation already embedded from the start. So this was a way to still get a lot of benefits out of that process, not just do it only for the sake of having done it, but to actually ensure that it was both providing clear impact evaluation results and signposts to the future about how to do things better. And so we found this worked pretty effectively. The research center found it really useful and has been taking forward the findings. And so this is one of the approaches that we're recommending as a way when you find yourself in that situation where you need to conduct impact evaluation, but the process is kind of well along the way. You have a few different options. You could just gather testimonials. You could gather some kind of relatively thin forms of evidence to talk about impact. But this provides a way to get a more systematic and accurate view of what's going on with impact in a way that can then inform your future work.
Yeah, and I think one of the issues as well, if you're just collecting testimonials, is that you've got all of this text, all of these ideas. How do you sort through that, make sense of them? And perhaps you take a kind of a qualitative analysis approach to this, but what you've got then is just this big, long narrative, perhaps now subdivided with a few subheadings and broken up with a few quotes, but quite hard to get your head around. And I think in contrast to that, you can have all of that stuff to accompany a report, but you've got these theory of change diagrams in it as well. I'll put a link to one of your videos where you talk about this and you can actually see this. But for people listening, can you describe what these theory of change diagrams look like? Because I've just seen the reaction people have to these is like, oh, here's our entire project that we worked on for the last 5 years, or the entire program with multiple projects. And you can see how, A, what the impacts are, and B, how we actually got there, all on a single PowerPoint slide. It is really powerful.
Yeah, so basically what they look like is they run from left to right, and starting on the left, you see the kind of activities that were done to start off the impact. So that could have been a project inception meeting that involved key stakeholders. It could have been an engagement workshop. Whatever the kind of starting point was, you see on the far left of the diagram. And then as you make your way from left to right, you see the intermediary steps that affect whether impact happens or not, the kind of forks in the road that people would encounter as they were working to develop impact. So, for example, a key element would be making sure that you have the right stakeholders involved to ensure that they're ready to bring that impact to fruition. And so the steps that were taken to ensure that, for example, a systematic stakeholder analysis, whether that was done could be a kind of key fork in the road that affects whether impact keeps going along the way from left to right. And then where we arrive to ultimately passing through a number of intermediary steps and intermediate outcomes, we ultimately arrive at the actual benefits that we can see documented that are associated with this research work. So on the far right of the diagram are the end results, the bottom line, what was delivered in terms of valuable impacts. And that is the kind of the full picture that you get then is the activities that you institute to generate impact all the way through to the impact at the end. And the value of theory of change is providing that middle picture, that kind of middle stages that are so easy to overlook in impact planning because they're complicated. If you don't have prior experience in that area, it's very easy to miss them. So these are really important middle steps, and that's the kind of critical benefit that you get from theory of change.
I think for me, the other thing that I've loved about this process is the way that this is not just summative, it's formative. And the way that you construct this is using multiple forms of data collection. There's surveys, there's interviews, there's focus groups, drawing on social media data, whatever you can get your hands on. But the process then it actually brings the group together to look at that analysis, what's coming out, to sense check that, to deepen in that, to add detail to that. And in these workshops, just watching people learn from each other as much as they are from the data, and then at the end of that process, just all of the rich lessons for how we can do things better, rather than just knowing, we got some impact and we missed a whole load of really important opportunities, and we created a few negative unintended consequences as well. There's a real sense of, we could have done better, but this is exactly how we will do better in future. And it's a really empowering process. So one of the things that...
I think the future orientation is helpful.
Sorry, Eric.
I was just saying that the future-oriented nature is really important. It really helps people to see that we're not just kind of poring over problems or barriers or mistakes just to be kind of negative, but we're trying to construct a future model of how to be as effective as possible. So that future orientation is really important in the kind of theory of change work.
Yeah, totally agree. Sorry, there's a bit of a delay on the line there, but just to conclude, I think one of the things I love about working with you, Eric, is just the passion that you bring to your work. And my hope is that by this point in the series, looking at evaluation, that you as a listener are beginning to get excited about evaluation. And it's a kind of a weird thing. You coming into this, most people are like, yeah, this is boring. This is not my day job. This is not what I do. I'm creative. I'm curious. I'm a researcher. This is the domain of consultants, other people who might do this for me. And actually, my hope is there's a sense that you have that, you know what, this is actually really exciting. I want to do this. I want to get my hands dirty. I want to try some of this stuff out myself. You bring that same passion that I do to evaluation. And I wonder, what is it that you love most, Eric? Whether this is evaluating your own impact, and so like me, you do environmental research. You work across a number of different research topics, domains, and you try to generate impact from that work. And we're increasingly doing that together. Or whether it's helping other people evaluate their impact. What do you love most about this?
I love that it's possible to see the impact that's being developed. I mean, a lot of people are in the business of trying to develop impact, whether they kind of recognize that, whether they use that term or not. And I've seen the difference that it makes to take an evidence-based approach where you are doing evaluation and you're seeing what's working, what's not, you're reconstituting your approach, you're adjusting as you go along. That model is super effective, and it really increases the impact that people can have. So I've seen the difference between that and the kind of grasping in the dark approach, which is the more common scenario, where you kind of hope that it's working, you feel in your gut like it's working, but there's no actual evidence about where you're hitting the mark, where you're missing the mark, and how to make adjustments. So the potential to take the same investment of effort, of time, of resources, and have it deliver much greater effects and benefits. That's what I'm so enthusiastic. That's why I'm so enthusiastic about evaluation, is because it can mean that without any further investment, you still get a much greater value from that effort.
The power of doing things properly. I love it. Eric, it has been a pleasure. Thank you for coming onto the podcast. It's been insightful and fun as ever.
Thanks for having me.